Okay, well, if we're studying philosophy in this class, I'm doing it in kind of like a story format. And as I've emphasized all throughout the class, it's more important to understand the flow of the ideas and how things shifted and how the thinking of Western culture shifted. And that's more important than the dates or the names or the details. I want you to understand the big ideas in this class. And so because of that, I've set it up this way. And really, I think it's accurate, though, that philosophy, for the most part, is a search for ultimate answers. We're trying to figure out what's real, what's true, what's the meaning of life, what's the purpose of it all. And so, if that is the primary, if not the, then definitely one of the primary goals of philosophy, then how do we get those answers? What tools or paths do we go down to try to find the answers, these ultimate answers? And we've seen throughout the semester that different combinations of faith and reason have been proposed as the way to get those answers or achieve the right answers. The last couple of weeks we've been looking at stage 6. So we've worked our way down through all these 6 stages as I've summarized them in this chart. And we're looking at the movements in this last final stage, stage 6. Last week we talked about a movement called existentialism. And technically this movement didn't happen or didn't begin until after World War II. But those existential thinkers after World War II, mostly from France and Germany, looked back to a lot of thinkers in the 1800s. And so we saw Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, among others, who were precursors, and sometimes are called the father of existentialism. And I think existentialism, really, if you've been following along this semester, existentialism really summarizes stages 5 and 6 really well, right? The 2 steps of existentialism summarizes stage 5 and 6. Because basically, according to the existentialists, there's 2 steps to their philosophy. First, you have to have an existential crisis where you recognize that there is no meaning to life, and that's pretty much stage 5, what our entire culture went through. But they're talking to individuals. Individuals need to recognize that. But after you recognize that, even though that is very overwhelming and crushing and can be depressing, there's hope, according to the existentialist, because then that allows you, what I've been describing as stage 6, but what the existentialists say is then you can choose your meaning to life. You can define what your purpose is or who you are through your choices. And that is just another movement in this stage 6, existentialism. So a little bit of different emphasis than romanticism, but it's all part of this same stage where meaning is found in here. Meaning and purpose and the ultimate answers come from within. It was the move inward, as is often called in philosophy. So stage 6 not only includes existentialism, it includes romanticism, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Freud, all of those things and movements and people we've talked about that place the emphasis on our internal passions, feelings, desires, and choices. Well, we're going to move on tonight to our next big movement. This is continuing down stage 6. And this next big movement, that's part of this, as I've called it, faith by itself, irrational faith, because it's not based on reason, it's based on your feelings and emotions and passions and desires. The next big movement we're going to talk about is structuralism. Now, structuralism, I think this is probably the first movement that we're going to look at that didn't start in philosophy. It actually started in anthropology. But it moved into philosophy, and not only philosophy, but a lot of other subjects were influenced by this movement. But philosophers and philosophy definitely picked up on it, as you'll see tonight. Now, structuralism, the structuralists, they opposed existentialism. Or I should say, they opposed certain aspects of existentialism. Structuralism is also part of stage 6, so there's going to be a lot of similarities between the existentialism and romanticism and everything in stage 6. But the structuralists, just because of the fact that they're a different movement, it should key you in to realize, well, there must have been some difference between them and the existentialists, or there wouldn't have been a new movement. And that's exactly right. There were some specific things that they rejected within existentialism. And I'll try to explain what those things are. The main thing that the main problem that the structuralists had with existentialism is that they felt existentialism overestimated our freedom. Remember, that was a key big part of existentialism, was that we are individually free to make our own choices, and when we do that, we define ourselves. We create meaning and purpose through our individual free choices. So the existentialists placed a huge emphasis on free will. And the structuralists came along and they said, no, people aren't that free. Individual human beings don't have that much freedom to make their own choices. So what did they think determined people's choices then? If people weren't free to define themselves through their choices, what, according to the structuralists, took that freedom away or caused people to be determined instead of free? Well, the structuralists said people, their thinking and their choices aren't free because they've been programmed by their culture. Okay? So they had the structuralists placed a large emphasis on how much our surroundings influence us. And we've talked a lot about that in this class, how much the culture around us influences us. Art, movies, paintings, novels, literature, entertainment, songs, TV, all those things influence us. Our parents, our education, our school, our teachers, all that is part of culture. And I definitely agree that all those things influence our thinking, but the structuralists took this to a whole nother level. And they said that we are so influenced by the culture around us that we're actually determined to think in certain ways because of that. And we can't break free of the cultural influence around us. We are influenced, really programmed or determined to think the way we do because of the culture we were raised in. Our parents, our religion, our friends. And so they rejected the existentialist idea that we are free and we're able to think for ourselves, make our own choices. They said, no, that's not how it works. You might think you have original ideas. You might think you're free to make your own choices, but you really don't have any original ideas. All the ideas that you have are just different combinations or ideas and beliefs that you've inherited from your culture. And you can't break out of those. According to the structuralists, it's impossible to break out of that. All of your thinking and hence all of your choices come from your cultural influences. You can't define yourself, and this is the key difference. Write this down if you're taking note. You don't define yourself, your culture defines you. So it's much more oriented towards the group or the community. You can say it in different ways. The community, the group, the culture, that's what generates meaning, purpose, definitions, defines who you are. The group does that as a whole, not individuals, but the group, the culture, the society, the community that you're part of. And so your culture might just be the people that, sometimes we think of culture as like, well, it's an American culture, it includes the entire nation. Well, they might be referring to that, or they could be just referring to the little microcosm of the culture that you've grown up with. Your family, your church, your school, you know, we're all divided up into these different groups, so to speak, according to the structuralists. But whatever group you're part of, they're the ones who have generated and developed meaning and purpose, and you inherit those from your group or culture. And that's why it's called structuralism. It's kind of a long name, but basically what they're saying is that every group or every community develops these structures of thinking. So it's not like a physical structure, like a building, but it's a categorical structure, way of thinking, categories, concepts. Every community, every culture builds these structures of thinking, these thought structures. And you're just a product of the thought structure that you grew up in. You just inherited through language, through entertainment, through influence of family and friends. You have just inherited those thought patterns and you can't break out of them. So communities create meaning, not individuals. That's the key difference. Now the structuralists said language was a huge part of this. That's why I chose this picture, because they placed a large emphasis and focus on the study of language. Because I said that's often how these ideas are communicated to us, through our languages. And within our languages, there's categories and concepts. And so even at the level of language, you've been trained, whether you realize it or not, you've been trained to think certain ways just through the language, the concepts, the terms that you've been taught to use and learn yourself. So our cultural reality is constructed, these structures of thinking are constructed by the language and the concepts we used. I know this is all rather abstract, it's very conceptual, but that's how the movement began and took hold and grew and became a very influential movement. So, as I've been saying in the class, I would agree, you know, at one level that our culture around us influences us tremendously. However, I don't think I'd go as far as the structuralists did, because the structuralists claim that you cannot break out of that thinking. You can't have an original idea. You can't have an original thought, because you're just stuck in these ways of thinking that you inherited. One classic example they would always use is think about the medieval era, right? So maybe before the year 1000. So the time period roughly from 400 to 1000 AD, the Middle Ages or medieval era. They said, think about that culture for a moment, and according to them, that culture was so built, the thought structures of that culture were so built around the idea of a God, a monotheistic God, that it would be impossible in that culture to be an atheist. It would be impossible because that wasn't even a conceptual possibility in the thought structure of that culture and language. You couldn't even think that way, according to the structuralists. So that was a classic example that they would often use. There was another phrase that became associated with this movement. This popular phrase went like this: the artist is dead, or the death of the artist. This movement is showing us how really there is no such thing as original art. The artist is dead became a popular phrase associated with this movement. Because think about it, what they were trying to express through that little phrase, in the past, we used to think that artists could be unique individuals, right? They could think for themselves, they could be creative, they could express new and original ideas that they had. But if structuralism is true, then that's not the case. All artists are doing are just expressing what their culture has programmed them to think. They might think that they're free, they might think that they're creative and original, but actually no, their community or their group or their society, their culture has programmed them to think that way. And so they're not really doing anything new or original in their art. So that's why it was said, the artist is dead. Well, this became such a dominant movement that it kind of overtook existentialism. This movement, critiquing existentialism, grew large enough that it overtook existentialism as a primary movement. I want to share with you just one individual associated with this movement, not the Levi Strauss genes. He just happened to have that name. But he was a famous, influential anthropologist. So as I said, a lot of this thinking came from anthropology, but then moved on into all sorts of other fields. Psychology, philosophy, of course, and other academic fields. So here's a quote from Strauss. He said, "I claim to show not how men think in myths," and when he uses the word myth here, he's talking about the cultural ideas in the culture, the structures of thought that the culture has developed. "I'm claiming to show not how men think in these myths or thought structures, but how these myths or thought structures operate in men's minds without their even being aware of the fact." So, he's trying to illuminate us and tell us that you're not even aware of this, but all of your thinking has just been programmed into you by your cultural surrounding. Your group has programmed you to think the way you do. You might think you're free to make your own choices and think for yourself, but actually your group, through these thought structures, have programmed you and determined you, so you're not really free, like the existentialist said. Well, I want to move on quickly to the next big movement that came along as we're walking through now the 20th century, the 1900s, existentialism after World War II, then structuralism. And out of structuralism, this was when I guess we started to lose our creativity of naming things. But the next movement that kind of came out of structuralism was called Post-Structuralism, right? So not very innovative, but somebody used it at some point in time and it stuck. And these are the three names we're going to look at in this movement, which originally was called Post-Structuralism. Rorty, Foucault, and Derrida. Rorty was an American philosopher, and Foucault and Derrida were both French philosophers. Now, they came out of structuralism, where they, began their careers or their thinking in the movement known as structuralism, but they began to critique it a bit. Just like the structuralists critiqued existentialism, these guys started to critique structuralism. Well, what do they have a problem with? Well, one of the things they said is, look, we, or you, structuralists, are doing the same thing that you're accusing others of. You structuralists are creating your own thought structures and forcing it on other people. So you, structuralists, us, as they were part of that movement, we're doing the same thing. We're creating these categories and thoughts, and then we're trying to impose those ways of thinking, those categories of thinking on other people. And so it was like an internal critique, if you will. But then it went in a kind of a new direction, which I'll try to explain that tonight by looking at these three men in particular. So it was similar to structuralism, but there were some key differences. Now, what I'm about to explain here is a bit confusing, and I apologize for this. It's just the jargon. Every field has its jargon and terms you just have to learn. Sometimes the terms don't even make sense, but they were used at one point, became popular, and they stuck. So we just got to learn this terminology. So what happened is this movement originally was called Post-Structuralism, but eventually it was renamed as Postmodernism. Okay? So the Post-Structuralists became known as the Postmodernists. Now I know that's really confusing because I haven't been using the term postmodern that way in this class. And that's why we need to talk about just the term postmodernism for a minute here. Just some etymology, just some history of the term. As best as we can tell, the first time the term postmodern was used was in 1917 by this guy Rudolf Panwitz, and he used it as a term to describe the post-Nietzschean nihilism of the 1900s, like the World War I, and people were just so overwhelmed with the carnage of World War I. As best as we can tell, that was the first time that the term was used. But like all terms, you know, the meaning changes and people use the same term to mean different things. It's kind of like the word bark, right? You can use the word bark to talk about the noise a dog makes, or you can use the term bark to refer to the stuff on the side of trees. Well, postmodernism is one of those terms that can be used to describe different things. And so you just always have to be careful when you hear the term, what does the speaker or the author mean by it, okay? Now, one common way to use the term postmodernism is to use the term to mean all those movements in the 18 and 1900s that were reacting against modernism. And that's how I've been using it so far in this class, right? You know, for weeks now, I've been using the term postmodern in that way to describe all these movements, existentialism, romanticism, all the movements that were reacting against modernism. And they have some things in common. Most of them, you know, are proposing the idea that truth is found in here. So sometimes the term postmodern is used just to talk about this general 200-year era of thinking. But sometimes the term postmodernism is used to describe this specific movement that developed in the 1970s, which includes these post-structuralists, Rorty, Foucault, and Derrida. Okay? So you just have to be careful when you use the term. Sometimes you have to specify how you're using it. When you hear others use the term, they might be talking about this specific movement in the 1970s, or they might be using it how I've been using it in this class so far, just as a general, more broad way to describe this 200-year period. And I apologize for that confusion. If I was having to create these terms and names, I wouldn't do this, but these structures have already been created and we just have to inherit them, I guess. So tonight, even though for all the previous classes this semester I've been using the term postmodern in a broader sense, tonight, from now on, when I talk about postmodernism, I'm going to be referring to specifically this movement in the 1970s, began in the 1970s, okay? So let's talk about this specific movement then, postmodernism, that began in the 1970s. Well, some of the things that they continued from their structuralism days, right, some of the ideas that they carried forward from structuralism, is that culture, groups or communities are the entities that generate meaning and purpose. They create meaning and purpose, not individuals. So they're still affirming relative truth, just not relative to the individual. So if you go back to existentialism or like Kierkegaard, what is true for me might not be true for you. Truth was more at an individual level. But these guys, the postmodernists, like the structuralists, said that no, truth was created at the group level, at the cultural level. So it's still relative, it's just relative per group. So something might be true for this group, but not for that group. This group created their own purpose and meaning together, and this group sees things a different way. Maybe they have a different worldview. So the term is still used, but now it's used to describe not an individual's worldview, but a group's worldview. So Christians have a worldview, atheists have a worldview, you just have all these groups. Americans have a worldview, Africans have a worldview. So all these different groups have developed their own view of things. It's still relative truth, but it's relative per group, not per individual. Like the structuralists, I'm kind of pointing out their similarities with the structuralists. They maintain that individuals don't create their own identities. Individuals don't define themselves. Groups define themselves. You're part of a cultural, linguistic group, and that's what defines you. So you're defined by the group or groups that you're a part of. And you can kind of see this if you think about it. This is very common even still in our culture today, where people define themselves by their group. This thinking has taken hold in a lot of our culture. So the groups that they emphasized were gender groups. Males have a certain view of things, females have a different view of things. Your group, you might be defined by the race that you're a part of, your sexuality, whether you're homosexual or heterosexual, that group defines who you are. So you're defined by your ethnicity, maybe socioeconomic classes. Are you in a wealthy class or a poor class? It's all these groups is what defines you. You don't define yourself as an individual, that's impossible. But these groups, being a part of these different groups, and they have created meaning for you. Obviously, a big part of this was the groups that are being oppressed and groups that are oppressors. So you can see a lot of critical theory and critical race theory is being developed in and through this movement. Picks up a bit from Marxism, right, with the poor and the wealthy, the different Marxist classes or groups. Those are the things that define you. You're defined by the groups or group that you're a part of, not as an individual. So each group develops its own worldview. Each group develops its own interpretation of reality, its own truth. And there's no way to judge which group has the right view, because we're all stuck in our particular cultural views. There's no way to take off your view and look at reality objectively to be able to say, yes, this group is right and that group is incorrect. You can't do that because you're stuck in your cultural, you can't break out of it. That was another thing they agreed with the structuralists about, is you're stuck in the way your group has taught you to think, and you can't break out of that view. That's just how you have to view reality. Nobody can step out of their view to judge objectively what's really real, objective reality. This was also their view of reason and science. So like a lot of these movements, they had a very low view of reason and science. In the past, people thought that reason, and specifically science, which is just a particular application of our reason, could get us objective truth. And they said, no, it's impossible to have a direct connection to objective reality. Even scientists see things through their groups. Maybe scientists are a group and they have a particular scientific worldview, and they can't break out of that to see reality as it really is. So they rejected the idea of objective truth. Even if there was objective truth, none of us could know it because we're just stuck with our views. And in fact, what they said is that when people or a group steps up and claims that they have objective truth, what's actually going on is they're trying to impose their view on you. They're trying to control you. So any claim to absolute truth, any claim to objective truth is actually a power play. They're actually trying to control you or force their way of thinking on you. And these postmodernists said you need to resist that. So this is very Nietzschean. You might be thinking to yourselves, well, this sounds a lot like Nietzsche, where interpretation or someone's view of things is based on power. And yes, they would totally agree. So they're very Nietzschean in that sense. So Nietzsche wrote, all things are subject to interpretation. He also said we can't know objective truth. We just have to interpret it. We all have our different interpretations. Nietzsche wrote, whichever interpretation prevails at a given time is a function of power and not truth. And so what you have, according to these postmodernists then, are all these groups vying for power or control of people's thinking. All these groups are just trying to convince others that they should think their way. And so they're just power plays. Anybody who claims to know truth, anybody who claims to know objective reality is just trying to control you. So in this sense, knowledge is power. Not in the traditional sense, but actually in a more literal sense. That any knowledge claim, what's really going on behind the scenes, the ulterior motives, is they're trying to enforce their power, their will to power, if you want to talk about it in Nietzschean terms, over you. So just give you an example. If a Christian stands up, or a church, or a denomination, or me as a pastor, would say something is true, the Bible is true, Christianity is true, something like that. And I say this is really true. It's not just my view, it's not my opinion, but this is actually real. God really exists out there objectively. Well, they would call foul on that and say, well, what you're really doing, even if you don't realize it, is you're trying to have power over other people. You're trying to control them with your ideas, even if you don't realize that that's your actual motive. You don't know objective reality. You're just trying to exert power and control over others when you make those claims. So another example that they would often use was modernism. Obviously, they're part of this postmodern movement in a broad sense, so they're very much against Enlightenment thinking. They're very much against reason, very much against science and modernism. And they used it a lot as an example of how this works, how this happens. So they said, Western culture, Western civilization tried to take our truth, or Western truth, capitalism, technology, democracy, individual rights. We've taken our Western truths and we've tried to impose our way of thinking on others. And that's, Western imperialism. And we've been doing that for hundreds of years. And then we do it under the banner of helping people, making things better for other countries, other people groups, other nations. But actually what we're doing is we're just trying to control them and exert our dominance, our way of thinking on others. All of this has just been a power play by Western civilization. So they were very much against, this idea of Western imperialism. They said, in the name of reason, in the name of truth and reality, Western culture has imposed its dominance and oppression and destruction around the world. All this talk about progress, democracy, equality before the law was just rhetoric to mask the oppression and brutality of Western capitalism. Even if some of these Western imperialists didn't realize what they were doing, that was actually their ulterior motives. They even thought this way of science too. So as we Western civilization has tried to spread science around the world, they said that's also a form of power and control. They said, well, just think of what scientists do. Consider for a second what scientists do. They define you, they categorize you, they label you, you're bipolar. So a doctor, a scientist gives you a label, and that's them exerting power and control over you. If they can label you or define you, then they're telling you what you're like. And then you buy into that label and you identify with it. But they're just exerting their way of thinking on you when they just categorize you or put you into different labels, definitions. So experts do this, doctors do this, scientists do this, governments give people labels, and they would encourage people to reject, resist experts and authorities, scientists, doctors, governments, when they try to control you this way, when they try to define or explain who you are. As I've been saying, they did not believe in objective reality. There was no way that we could connect with an independent, existing reality. We're all just stuck in our group's worldview. All that there is are these different competing, culturally constructed views of reality, just different competing visions, competing ideas as different groups are trying to convince others to adopt their view. And they said, America is the perfect example of this. You know, look at America, and all of these simulated realities are fighting for power and influence over others. What do we have in America? They said America is the ultimate postmodern experience. We have, you know, just endless amount of advertisements, companies who are manipulating you, trying to get you to buy their stuff. So they create these realities for you, create these ways of thinking that, man, I really do deserve a new car. I really do need that RV so I can go camping on the weekend. They create these realities in your thinking to manipulate you to buy their products. Coke, if I'm drinking Coke, then I'm having a good time. So advertisements are a classic example of that. Politicians are trying to put their spin on things and get you to buy into their way of thinking so that people will follow you. So you got politicians who are putting spin on things, trying to get you to vote for them and follow them. All the entertainment we do are simulated forms of reality. Our TV, we watch the show Friends because it simulates the feeling of having friends. You don't really need actual friends, but you can just simulate these sort of realities for yourself with entertainment, movies, literature, comic books, video games nowadays, I guess. But all of these things. They used Disneyland as the ultimate farce, right? Disneyland, we actually know that it's all fake. All these different places in Disneyland and Disney World that look like they're other countries, but it's all a facade. It's all just these buildings. You only see the front of them, and they look like they're a whole building, but it's just all pretend. And they said that it's the ultimate simulated reality, and we love it. We eat it up, even though we know it's simulated. But that's how all of our thinking works. The groups that we're in, the religions that we believe are just these simulated, invented realities that give us meaning through our respective group. Now, ironically, a lot of these postmodernists were very active politically, active in social activism, which is kind of ironic considering how they didn't, their own position said there was no truth, a real truth, yet they got very active in society and politics, usually arguing against capitalism, arguing against liberal forms of government, arguing against science and technology. So you see some influence of Rousseau's thinking here. They were not a fan of science. They said that science has no better claim to yielding truth than any other method or any other field. And usually the pursuit of scientific truth was just camouflage speech to hide the scientist's real goal. And the real goal of science is to conquer nature, to rape nature, to control nature, again, asserting their power and control over other things, in this case, nature. They opposed some other things that they stood for. They opposed individual rights, freedoms, and identities. They instead promoted class groups and group warfare, worker class, race classes, gender classes. As I said, a lot of critical theory is tied up into this and comes from a lot of this postmodern thinking. So in terms of laws, individual rights is another big thing that came out of the Enlightenment, right? Individual rights and freedoms are laws. They said, the postmodernists said that the laws we have in Western civilization are just cover for asserting the power and interests of white males. And so we need to overcome the law, overcome the authorities in Western civilization. And by doing that, we will help knock down the white males from being in power. And so they were very open to forceful assertion of the interests of oppressed groups. So I said we were going to talk about three of these most famous postmodernists, and we'll start with Richard Rorty. He was an American philosopher, probably the most famous philosopher in the 1980s. He was that influential. So he's got this quote I wanted to share with you. I've summarized the first part of it here because it was so long, but in a sense, he's saying the same thing that I am about the pre-modern, modern, and postmodern eras. So he uses different terms, but he's talking about the same eras. The age of faith would be the pre-modern era, and the Enlightenment is part of the modern era. But he said now that we're in postmodernism, the postmodern task is to figure out what to do now that the age of faith, pre-modernism, and the Enlightenment, modernism, seem dead, seem beyond recovery. But as I said before, it's kind of ironic that they would even propose any philosophy. Because philosophy for thousands of years has been the pursuit of truth, what is really real. And they recognize that we're claiming that nothing is really real, that there is no objective truth. And they realize the irony of them being philosophers, but then not being able to claim that something is actually true. And so he's got this quote here I wanted to share. He said, realizing this irony, he said, the difficulty faced by a philosopher like myself, a postmodernist, is to avoid hinting in my philosophy that I get something right. That my sort of philosophy actually corresponds to the way things really are. For this talk of correspondence, correspondent truth, correspondence theory of truth, brings back just the idea that my sort of philosophy wants to get rid of. The idea that the world or the self has an intrinsic nature, that there are actual objective truths. Remember, we've talked about nature and essences, so on and so forth. So, according to Richard Rorty then, what do we do as philosophers? Well, one of the things that he proposed was that we celebrate this fragmentation, that this fragmenting into groups and just all these different groups with their different worldviews is actually a good thing. That fragment truth, and this is good because it keeps any one group from having too much control, from imposing their view on everybody else. So this is actually a good thing that we have all these fragmented groups because it prevents any sort of totalitarianism or authoritarianism. So this should be something that should be promoted. Class warfare even should be promoted because it keeps us from having one group in total control. Again, though, I don't think he can escape this problem because he's trying to say that something is good, something is right, something is true. But as a postmodernist, he really can't claim that. It just seems completely a position to collapse in on itself. Okay, let's move on to the next main thinker in this movement, and that is this fun-looking guy by the name of Jacques Derrida. You can see we're getting right up to today. I mean, he just passed away in 2004, so we're moving along in history, getting very close to where we're at now in 2020. So Jacques Derrida, you're probably familiar, he's most famous for his idea of deconstructionism, which is a big term, but I'll try to explain what he was trying to propose through his deconstructionism. Basically, he rejected the idea that text, and when I say text here, I mean not just textbooks or even books, but any speech, any writing, any use of language, really. So all texts, all uses of language, he rejected the idea that they have objective meaning or true interpretations. Okay? He said all texts, all speech, all writing, all use of language is merely an expression of a culture's worldview. So even if an author, let's say I give a speech, or I'm teaching this class, or I write a book, right? Any time I'm using language, even if I, as the person who is using the words, say, this is what I mean, he would say, no, that's not actually what you mean. He would deconstruct the text. He would deconstruct what I was actually saying. He would look past the actual words I was using and what I was claiming to mean, and he would deconstruct that to expose my real hidden agenda. So you could take the Bible, you could take a science textbook, you could take a speech that a president gave. You know, any time that somebody would use language, written language, speeches, anything like that, you could deconstruct it. You could deconstruct the text or what they said or wrote to get to what they were actually trying to accomplish. It's never what they claim to be meaning, but there's always some ulterior motive there, which is usually about control or manipulation. So all speeches, all uses of language, all books, all texts are an attempt to force others to view things the way that you view things. And so he promoted this idea of deconstructing texts so you can loosen the control that they have over you. This was a helpful process to deconstruct these texts so then they won't have as much control over your thinking. You can kind of become aware of what these folks, writers, speakers, anybody who's using language are really trying to do, so they don't influence and control you. You can break the hold that they have over you through this process of deconstruction. Now, this is really picked up in English departments, literature departments, this way of thinking. In fact, the English departments at our universities are the most postmodern departments, and they're going to be the most anti-Christian groups on campus, usually, because of the influence of postmodernism and continental philosophy, you could say. I didn't realize that, when I was a college student in the mid-90s, and as a young Christian, I thought I would be getting a lot of criticism for my Christian beliefs in my science classes. But in fact, or my philosophy classes, I was worried about taking philosophy. But my philosophy professor was a strong Christian, a world-famous Christian philosopher. My astronomy, I didn't take many science classes because I was a business major, but my astronomy professor was a strong Christian. But it was when I went to my English classes is where I was criticized and ridiculed for my Christian beliefs the most. And it was because of the influence of postmodernism in English and literature departments. And this has been very influential in those groups, English and literature departments at our universities. Well, I want to show you a quick video. It's another one of those 8-bit philosophy video game videos that I find to be really entertaining and informative. And this is a video they put together on Jacques Derrida. And we'll put the link down below so you don't have to watch it through our screen here tonight. You can click on the link and watch it directly on their YouTube channel. But take a look, and hopefully it'll come in decent enough you can get a feel for what they're saying here.
Is it as simple as pointing at the animal we call cat and then saying the word? 20th century philosopher Jacques Derrida would say, no, the word cat is not simply a reference to the furry, four-legged creature that meows and is indifferent to your existence. In other words, we don't get the meaning of cat so easily. Language is quite a bit more complicated. Thinkers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle all ground thinking in the belief that there is an objective truth that can be apprehended through philosophy. They understood philosophy as a sort of journey where, through practice, the truth and falsity of our claims are eventually revealed. For Derrida, however, privileging reason as the way to achieve objective truth is itself problematic. Deconstruction is a way of showing that our assumptions about language and objectivity are flawed. There is no reference point outside of text, no way to think outside of language, no correct and true word for actions or objects. There is no objective truth. There is no significance in the words themselves. Calling a jump kick a snarflag, a punch a flimflam, a guy a bobo, or a cat a zuttig-nuggin-jax is just as good as any other word. In his loquacious work of grammatology, Derrida famously asserts that there is nothing outside of the text. What he means is that we come to understand everything about the world through language, and as such, it is inescapable. The way that we come to know language isn't from an encounter with the true essence of a term, but rather the meaning is created in relation to other words, or what Derrida calls différence. For example, we know what cat means because we understand the idea of feline, domestic animal, and pet. We understand pet as not feral, as a friend. We understand friend as not an enemy. We comprehend enemy as an opposing force. We know that by force, in this instance, we don't mean the multiplication of mass and acceleration, but rather an entity or person. And we comprehend person as not an animal, as not a cat. Each concept points to another concept to be defined ad infinitum, the meaning of a term turtles all the way down. Moreover, all text is unreliable. There is no single or objective meaning of words. Most texts contain conflicting narratives that intersect and contradict. Deconstruction points out these contradictions. And that is how deconstruction is both construction and destruction. Hence, the wordplay. But when does deconstruction end? Really, isn't a cat just a cat?
So I think you can, just from that quick little fun video, I think you can kind of see what he's getting at there is that, language is just, there's no escaping it. There's just terms that refer to other terms. There's no connection to language. There's no connection between language and external reality. All of our language are just cultural constructs that have to stay within our minds, stay within our constructs. Well, yeah, we can invent new terms, and then those terms are just defined by other terms, but these terms never match up with reality because our thinking, our understanding, our ability to know things can never match up with reality. So language is just stuck. There's nothing beyond the text. There's nothing beyond our languages because there's nothing beyond our worldview. There's no way that we can access reality. So our language can't access reality. Our language is just this enclosed construct that we've created that has no connection with external reality. It's a very pessimistic, when it comes to us being able to know things or know reality, it's very pessimistic about that. Okay, let's talk about one last thinker, and this is Foucault, another French philosopher. Now he, probably more than the others, is the one who made postmodernism so popular in the culture, especially with young people. And you can kind of imagine why young people would gravitate towards this, because they're, everybody who's young, and me when I was young, we have a tendency not to trust authority, or we feel like authority is always just trying to tell us what to do, governments, police officers, parents, churches, teachers, right? They're just trying to control us. And so a lot of this is appealing to young people because it's, a way to break out of those people that are just trying to control us with their categories and labels. And so it was very appealing to young people. And Foucault, made it very, very popular. When he would give lectures, there'd be thousands of people that would show up. It was just like, almost like Jordan Peterson is nowadays, but even to a greater degree, he was so popular in the 70s. Now, he took a lot of ideas from philosophers, some of them which we've studied, some of them we haven't, but Heidegger, Wittgenstein, Karl Marx, of course, and those guys took their views from Hegel, Schopenhauer, Kant, and Hume, Rousseau. So you see kind of a genealogy of thinking here, from Kant and Hume, Rousseau, down through Hegel, Marx, Heidegger, Wittgenstein, and now with these guys, the postmodernists, including Foucault. So we kind of were walking down this continental philosophy genealogy of thinking. But probably more than all of those, though, he took inspiration from Nietzsche's ideas. And so I found this clip this picture on the internet I thought was pretty funny. So here's Nietzsche, right? He's saying, I was postmodern before postmodernism was cool. Foucault made it cool, but Nietzsche was saying these things over 100 years earlier. So some of the things he took from Nietzsche is that he hated reason. He was very bothered by philosophers from the past who had thought reason could figure things out. So very much against modernism. Like Nietzsche, he critiqued modernism for limiting, teaching people that they shouldn't go after their passions and desires. He said of reason, Foucault said, reason is the ultimate language of madness. It tells us to suppress our healthy instincts and desires. He said that reason, Foucault said that reason is just a white, male, Eurocentric construct that's been created to keep white men in power. The idea of reason and logic. So he said, if people are going to try to be reasonable with you or use arguments of reason to fight against you, don't fight back with reason. Instead, fight back with just assertion, animosity, rhetoric, and a willingness to resort to physical violence. Just be aggressive. What you say doesn't really have to even make sense. It can just be rhetoric as long as it knocks down the oppressor. As long as it knocks down those in power, then what you're doing is good, even if it's unreasonable. So his main way of fighting against those in power, those trying to oppress you, was rhetoric. Doesn't have to be true, doesn't even have to be consistent, as long as it damages those in power. That's why I find it so ironic that, these folks, which were mostly on the left side of the political spectrum, some of them were extreme Marxists, not all of them, but definitely all on the left side of the political spectrum. I find it so ironic that when somebody like Donald Trump comes along and uses practically the same sort of strategy of just nonsense rhetoric and ends up winning or becoming president, influencing other people to think like he does or to follow him, that they call foul or get upset because somebody's using their strategy that they promoted against them, so to speak. And I was at a conference in Boston, and it was a American Academy, AAR, American Academy of Religion conference. So we've got all sorts of scholars that just study religion. They might not believe in any particular religion, they're just religious scholars. So maybe they're studying Buddhism in a scholarly sense, not that they believe it, maybe the history of Buddhism, whatever. So I remember just going to all these talks from these people from Yale, and it was in Boston, so Harvard, MIT, and this was right around 2016, 2017, and they were so upset. I mean, every talk they were just lambasting Trump, and I'm not, a huge Trump fan or anything, but they were just, complaining about Trump, but then at the same time, you could hear the cognitive dissonance, and some of them would even say it. I remember they were like, I've been teaching subjective truth, and I've been teaching relative truth, and that there is no real objective truth for all these years, but at the same time, I find myself so upset that Donald Trump is telling these lies, and what he says doesn't match up with reality. And so, they got this anger at this strategy that they've been promoting and proposing for years, now that it was used against them. I just thought it was so ironic. So back to Foucault. Main way to fight, according to him, was this rhetoric. He proposed moving beyond the limits set by the authorities and the experts, the scientists, the government leaders. He encouraged spontaneous acts of rebellion against authorities and the oppressors who were trying to control us with their truth. So he encouraged people to push up against society's conventions and traditions. He had this phrase he would use. He would encourage people to explore transgressions. Explore transgressions. He was an open homosexual, and he died of AIDS in the early 80s, when AIDS was really kind of new and taking a lot of lives. So let me sum up in just a minute here. Postmodernism that we've talked about tonight. A lot of influence on the culture. You probably, can hear or think of things that are being said right now in the culture in terms of race theory, critical race theory. group dynamics. You're defined by the group you're a part of. Okay, you're a homosexual, you're a transgender, you're a white male. That defines you. Even if you as an individual, haven't done what your group has done, well, you're defined by your group. That's what defines you, not you, your individual choices, but the group that you're a part of is what defines who you are. So that way of thinking is really big in our culture, especially right now, and it comes from this movement and structuralism. Interestingly enough, they didn't win all that many philosophers to their side, academic philosophers. And I think it's because of the irony, it's because of the internal contradictions. I mean, if your philosophy is that there is no such thing as philosophy, then it's kind of hard to do any work, right? It's really hard to try to propose things or try to teach that something is correct or right or true, but at the same time say that there is nothing correct, right, or true. So it's very internally contradictory. And so it's not, it sounds good, it's good rhetoric, but it's especially by those who are in philosophy, it can't sustain itself. And so a lot of academic philosophers, even though they might have danced with it a little bit, they moved on. And so there's been a lot of philosophy since academic philosophy, which has criticized this movement. And that's what we're going to talk about on our last lecture. My slides froze up, but I don't want you to miss this one. The last thing we're going to do in this class is look at those who have come along and have criticized postmodernism. So it won't be next week, because next week is Thanksgiving, and we'll look at the schedule here in just a minute, but I'm pretty sure it's the next week. So 2 weeks from tonight will be the last lecture of the class, and we're going to be looking at some of these philosophers who have criticized postmodernism. And some of these critics are modern philosophers. They think in a modern way. But some of them, as I've mentioned a few weeks ago, some of these critics of postmodernism are pre-modern philosophers. So there's been a resurgence in academic philosophy of pre-modern thinkers, and even a lot of Christians now working in the field of academic philosophy. So there's kind of been a renaissance of Christianity in academic philosophy. So I want to show that to you, look at some of these thinkers and how they've criticized postmodernism. That's what we'll do in our last lecture. So if you want to pull out your class schedule, we can talk through the rest of the semester, especially those of you taking it online. Make sure we're all on the same page. So tonight is November 19th. You guys had about 60 pages to read for tonight. And then you needed to write reading summaries to turn into Caleb by midnight tonight. So make sure you get those turned in November 19th to Caleb. Chapters 11 to 12 in the Francis Schaeffer book, and then chapter 11 in Christian philosophy. I gave a lecture tonight. We talked about structuralism, post-structuralism, which turned into postmodernism. No class next Thursday, Thanksgiving, November 26th. And then the last class will be December 3rd. You've got about 80 pages of reading, so you can do some of that over Thanksgiving break. Reading summaries are due. I'll give the last lecture, Critics of Postmodernism, on December 3rd. And then also that day, Caleb will email everybody the final exam on December 3rd. And then you'll have a week until December 10th to take the final exam. It'll be like the midterm. It'll be open note, open book. Spend as much time as it on you want. Make sure you follow Caleb's instructions so you write the word minimum requirement, but then turn that into him on December 10th. Also due on December 10th is your historical survey paper. So you could start writing on that now. I know we haven't covered everything. We've got one more lecture left, but you could start writing down and summarizing the history of philosophy that we've covered so far. And that will actually help you prepare for taking the final. Because as you can imagine, on the final there'll be questions. And really that's what we're doing in this class as a whole anyway, is a historical survey of these different thinkers and different movements and ideas. So you've got, all of the class handouts. You can go back and watch the lectures, some of those initial slides that I show pretty much every week. I think will be really helpful for you in writing that paper and studying for the final exam. Details for that historical survey paper can be found in the syllabus. I'm taking a look at page 2 of the syllabus. This historical survey paper is worth 1/4 of your grade, 25% of your grade. Needs to be a 5-page paper giving a broad survey on the history of Western philosophy, covering the major movements, schools of thought, and figures in Western philosophy. So more details in the syllabus, but if you have any more questions about it, you can email Caleb, and then email me if you have questions about any of the content that we've covered.